right. I think that works. So, can you tell me a little bit about your experiences with iteration before joining GitLab? What is I guess your perceptions or your history with that in your own life, either professionally or not professionally?
Well, I mean, when I hear iteration and think about it in the context of GitLab and past experiences, I think of scope creep. And I was frequently guilty of that. I see something in the next line above in a documentation. I think I've got to fix that. And the question with that is it easy or is it hard or how far do I let it go? And with that coming to GitLab was well, I mean, I've only been here, I guess, 8 or 9 months, whatever. But the culture shift is still sinking into my brain.
Yeah, something I kind of wanted to jump in. How are you feeling about that shift from previous experience to today? Because I can tell you about my experience. I came from a graphic design background, and I came from old style or old ways of thinking in my organizations. They were kind of either government or large enterprise, and so it was always not so much iteration, but go ahead and plan out the project and then only deliver the final thing, and we'll just move with that. So having to shift my thoughts from that process and show everyone every piece that I'm doing to try and say, hey, this is kind of iteration, small chunks. That's sort of where I was coming from with it.
Yep, that sounds like a classic waterfall situation, which the software community presumably is moving away from. But one of the failures therein, or at least my perception of where different companies fail at that, is that they don't practice iteration as a discipline. In other words, where you have minimal viable change, where you put something in that actually works and make things better. At that point, my perception of the GitLab way, and this is just speaking for myself because this interview came as a bit of a surprise. Does it make things better? If it makes things better, then it's ready to merge.
Yeah, it's definitely something I've always struggled with. Again, coming from that background where I have all these big ideas and I want to do things, these amazing changes, and then having to step back and say, no, let's think about the small thing, the quickest thing we can do, and then iterate off of that kernel or nugget to get to the big picture. And breaking things up from this big picture down to these kernels or nuggets has always been something that was a bit of a struggle for me too. And so for me here at GitLab, learning about that was it's an ongoing thing, which I appreciate. I'm still having these crazy big ideas, but then it's nice to have team members and colleagues to help us break them down a bit.
Thus the discipline, having actually breaking things down into manageable units, where each unit, once you succeed at it, it'll make things better and thus become something you want to push.
Yeah, it sounds also applicable to a lot of external things. For example, in tech writing, thinking about other forms of writing, like personal writing projects. If you're writing fantasy or biography or whatever, you have this large scope that you want to talk about, but then how do I break it down into digestible chapters?
Exactly.
And how do you work with tech writing in an iterative capacity in GitLab for now? Let's talk about it. We'll elaborate.
Mm-hmm. Right. For now, tech writers, well, in GitLab, we don't do a lot of writing as tech writers. Most of the stuff we get, most of our work comes to us because essentially we have so much work that's going on. There's no way that we could actually cover everything that's happening with sufficient clarity and justice. So everything comes in, and that which comes in becomes our MVC of sorts. And I subdivide that into 3 categories. Category 1 would be things at the typo level, which itself is MVC. You fix a typo, you know you've made things better. Category 2 are doc fixes. Somebody sees something that's inaccurate in the docs, they go and fix it. There's a temptation there to go ahead and look at other things in on the same page. Can you fix those as well? Maybe you do. If it's if it's something that's easy, but does that go beyond MVC? That's something I still struggle with. Category 3 would be new stuff. You have a new feature, you want to cover it. When we review it, I'd like to review things for technical accuracy from a more detached point of view, to say, hey, if I were reading this documentation and didn't know what the author already knows about it, would I be able to learn the process and actually implement the new feature in my own self-managed or whatever instance of GitLab? If the proposed documentation, the proposed new feature actually accomplishes that task, then great. Otherwise, then we talk about it and say, what's the minimal viable change? How do we minimally say, hey, here's the new feature, and how do we make it usable?
Yeah, that's something that I've always tried to, I guess, rely on tech writing for, is that expertise, or looking at that, okay, I have this tech blurb that I need to explain, and I know what I want to say, but I'm not sure if it makes sense. Should I be thinking about just say it as quickly and as succinctly as possible, or should I try and be more elaborate and think about the bigger issue or the bigger message, and then throw that down? And I always try and collaborate with y'all to say, hey, can you take a look at this, see if this makes sense? Can I come with this from a different perspective? And how do I break this down to a more logical and more digestible method of thinking or speaking?
And to that implied question, I have to give the wishy-washy answer. It depends.
Yeah, totally understandable. What's been interesting or been challenging, or where you think things could improve in sort of the iterative process, generally speaking, outside of GitLab, and then maybe specifically with teams or groups that you work with, or your orgs that you touch?
Uh, I mean, I see it happening, but the one thing I'd like to see more of is take the point of view of the customer, the person who's implementing our product, who is taking the feature and putting it in place. What does that person want? How do we make it easy for that implementer to actually make things work for them in a most efficient way? Uh, the feedback I'm seeing here at GitLab and before is the number one request is code samples. Code samples is sort of a catch-all for bits of code that you could put into a GitLab.rb file, or a REST call that you could run at the command line, or a command that you could use to activate or deactivate a specific feature, or similar sorts of things in the UI.
Yeah, I don't necessarily deal with the back end, the code aspects, so I'm always on the front end, and I'm always impressed by the assistance that y'all can provide, especially by that thought process or that methodology. Kind of related to that, what advice would you give a designer in terms of planning for problem solving, or planning for trying to address code or text or support documentation? And you mentioned a little bit about how, think of the user's perspective, think of what a user might be experiencing in that encounter.
Well, when we do things front end or back end, we get in depth. We know everything inside out about the language, about the spec behind what we're doing, about the parameters. The person who's implementing all this information may not know so much, and probably has a bunch of other different software components similar to GitLab to manage. So that person doesn't have a lot of time to deal with it, to actually learn the details. Given that they're so busy, they want to be told, hey, to implement this feature, all you need to do is A, B, and C. And this will solve problem X.
Yeah, I know, for example, when I'm, again, going back to writing a text or documentation, I try to think about that. This is what you need to get to this end solution. This is how it should work. And then here's the text around that. And then having it be sculpted or twisted a little bit to try and make a little more sense for the correct user persona or profile. That's one of the things I know I have experience or trouble with in my experience, is that making sure I'm talking to the right profile. Because again, where you said somebody might not have the breadth or the depth of knowledge or expertise on a particular topic, you want to make sure that you can focus it to that type of person who needs that extra push, so to speak, to try and either help explain it or better elucidate the problem, right?
And speaking probably a little too frankly, that goes to a weakness in our current documentation, where there's a lot of it that's essentially a dictionary. I mean, with uh, people who develop stuff, they're proud of their work, and people at GitLab should be proud of what we've done. So the temptation therein is to brain dump things, to go from A to Z or Z, and say this is everything you can do, and within that, take the person who's reading it and take his point of view. He looks at a dictionary and says, okay, what do I need? Good documentation is sort of like handholding. It tells them, hey, this is where you want to go to solve problem X.
Yeah, and so expanding on that, I think the documentation definitely can always improve. And looking at that from the tech writing team, how do you normally deal with that in terms of a team solution or team project? Normally, my only interactions are, hey, I need this issue looked at. Can you give me some help with this body of text, rather than looking at the totality of the support documentation, the technical documentation?
Well, we're only starting to look at it. In fact, as the tech writing team has, as of a year ago, I think there were 4, and now we're 11 or 13, depending on whether you include the managers in that number. And with the expanded numbers, we're starting to look at questions like that. How do we focus or refocus our documentation more on the right personas to actually solve our users' problems?
Yeah, that sounds really good. I appreciate that sort of way of tackling the problem. I think that's something that I know I've had experience with trying to understand documentation and then trying to see where the documentation lives, and then thinking how would a user experience or encounter that documentation, and how would they get to that through this process. So I definitely see the difficulties there.
And with that, we do appreciate the uh, idea that, okay, documentation is another UI. What's the user experience with documentation? And people like yourself saying, hey, let's analyze the documentation from a UX point of view and see what persona X, Y, and Z think it or can do with the documentation. I think that's great and will help guide us in creating a better experience for our users.
That sounds really nice. I like that. I wanted to ask, if you were to give advice to a designer or a tech writer who would be joining or applying the GitLab team, what would you have to say for them in regards to iteration and how it relates to tech writing?
Be prepared for a different kind of discipline. We believe in continuous, uh, I don't know if this is the right term, but we believe in continuous delivery. In other words, you've got to know when to push, when to let things go, And when to say, okay, it's not as perfect as I want it to be. Let's push it. What's the minimal viable change that actually makes things better?
Well, that's great. I appreciate that because I've also had the same struggles, just coming from the UX and UI side of it.
And when I got the notification yesterday for this, it made me think, okay, am I practicing MVC? And I'm realizing in some cases, no, but yes, this is a good way to think about MVC, or a good opportunity to think about it and think, okay, how can I make my own practices better? And with this talk to help others think in a similar fashion.
Yeah, I agree completely. I've had the same problems. So it's not just a unique experience, I would imagine.
No, none of us are perfect in this respect, but we can get better.
Yeah, always iterating, always getting better.
Exactly.
Well, cool. I think that's a good way to end the convo. I'm glad you could meet with me, and we'll chat with you again in our next meetings.
Fantastic. Thank you, Daniel.